have a checklist that we've developed for figuring out whether or not our learning objectives are really hitting some key marks. So I'm going to go through that checklist with you now. First off, let's look at a particular learning goal. Does this learning goal focus on what the student is going to be able to do? Not really. It's not really clear what students need to be able to do with the conservation of energy. So maybe instead, students will be able to use ideas of conservation of energy to solve problems. So one thing is that you want your goal to be expressed in what the student will be able to achieve or do. Now another thing is the goal needs to be well defined so that it's really useful to you as a guide.
Another reason why you want to have your learning goals really well developed is because as you're developing your learning goals, you're also going to be developing your forms of assessment. And you want to have forms of assessment that really capture what students understand and know about the topic. And so those two things go hand in hand. And so if you refine your assessment, then you refine your learning goal, and then it goes back and forth, so you really capture what it is that you want students to learn and be able to know and be able to show you at the same time.
So let's look back at that objective that I wrote before. Is this well defined? Not really. Maybe instead, students will be able to use conservation of energy to solve for the final speed of an object that falls from a given height. That makes a little bit clearer just what I expect them to do with conservation of energy, rather than just generally solve problems. Another thing is that you want the verbs that you use to have a clear meaning. If you use the word understand in your objectives, it's not really that clear. Lots of different people might mean different things by the word understand. So I often use Bloom's taxonomy to actually shop for verbs. You can see here that each level of Bloom's taxonomy has some verbs that are commonly associated with that level. And so this makes it really helpful if you're trying to write your goals to look for a verb that aligns with your expectations. So you can see here on the apply level, there are lots of different verbs. Maybe I'll focus in on solve and use. And that's going to help me write that revised learning goal that I gave you before. Students will be able to use conservation of energy to solve for the final speed. So that's helpful in writing that goal. What if I want to make an objective that's a little bit lower than that goal? Well, now I'm going to look over at the understand level and choose a verb there, and maybe I'll say students should be able to summarize the law of conservation of energy. So I've used the word summarize to write a new goal. What if I want to write a higher goal? So let's look under evaluate. So in this case, I want students to be able to defend something. So how might I do that with conservation of energy? Maybe students will be able to defend the choice of conservation of energy as a solution method for a given problem. So, using verbs that have a clear meaning can be very helpful in making your objectives very specific. Another thing that you want to make sure that is true of your objectives is that the terminology is familiar or common. And if the terminology is not familiar, then is the terminology itself a goal? Because you want your students to be able to understand your objectives without necessarily knowing the terminology. Now, in the goals that I showed you before about conservation of energy, you could say that conservation of energy is a terminology, but in that case, it is a goal for me that they understand what conservation of energy means. Another thing to consider is that the goal should align with your course scale goals. So remember, course scale goals are those big overarching goals that cover the course as a whole. So for example, maybe I have students will develop some problem solving skills. They'll be able to build scientific communication skills. Students will recognize that understanding in physics arises from careful experiment. So we'll often write big course scale goals like this first and then refer to those when we're writing the topic level objectives to make sure that our topic level objectives are helping students achieve those big goals. So you can see these two goals that we talked about, these two objectives that we talked about earlier do align with these course scale goals, except for the last course scale goal. Students will recognize that understanding arises from careful experiment. I would just have to make sure that I have some other objectives that would help students to achieve that general goal. Now, look at these two objectives that we've been looking at. These are really at different levels. So remember, Bloom's taxonomy is that tool that we can use to talk about different level objectives. So how does Bloom's taxonomy actually inform your choice of goals? You want to be covering a range of different levels of goals. So here's Jenny Knight to talk about that.
In pretty much any course you might be teaching, you should have a mix of learning objectives at different levels. Just because it's an introductory course doesn't mean that the learning objectives should be lower order, and just because it's an upper division course doesn't mean that the objectives should all be higher order in terms of Bloom's taxonomy. What you really want is a mix, and that's because students at any level will have to rely on some things they've remembered. And I'll speak specifically to biology. There's a lot of terminology in any discipline. So one does have to learn the terminology, and that's a lower order skill. But being able to apply the terminology later on is a higher order skill. So when one's writing a learning objective, I think sometimes the tendency is to think, oh, I've got to write everything at a really high level because I want my students to achieve this high level of cognition. I want them to have a deep understanding of the subject. And we do all want that for our students. But if all of your learning objectives are at the very top of the pyramid, they're all evaluation and synthesis, what gets lost for the students is how do they get there? So to do them a favor, you should include some lower order objectives as well to guide them along their process. And sometimes faculty find it helpful also to, when they write a really high level objective that seems quite large and all-encompassing, they can also write some sub-learning objectives that show the lower order skills that are required to get to that top level. And that can be something you share with your students or that you don't, but at least you know what the students actually required to do in order to get to the highest level.
Another thing to consider is that you want your goals to cover a range of different types of knowledge. Remember, we have cognitive abilities, procedures, metacognitive, attitudes, and beliefs. So we want to be covering the whole spectrum of understanding in the course. And then lastly, you really want to make sure that your goals are something that are going to be relevant and useful to students as much as possible.
So you want to move beyond what they're going to be doing in your course or in your kind of tests, and really what are the kind of qualities that someone needs to have to be effective in a real world situation. In a STEM context, it might be having certain qualities and skills that would allow someone to be really successful in a laboratory context. And some of those skills and knowledge are difficult to measure on a multiple choice test, but you'd really want to think about what those are when you're articulating your learning goals.
So, how do you make an objective useful? You use this checklist with yourself and others. This is helpful if you're trying to give other people feedback on their goals. You want to be choosy. If your list of learning objectives indicates you've got too much packed into this course, then you might want to remove some stuff to really keep your course tight and focused. And then test it out and refine it over time.
Learning is a two-way street. It's actually a joint accomplishment that happens between the instructor and the student. So you may be creating opportunities for students to learn in certain kinds of ideas, but they may be not necessarily taking them up in the ways that you think they're going to take them up. So often I find that I have to teach the course a couple of times before I really understand what my students are going to be able to learn from my course. So the first time I write my learning goals, it's kind of a stab in the dark. And then after I've taught the course a couple times, then I can see like, oh, this is what they're learning. These are the kinds of opportunities I'm creating, and this is how they're taking up these opportunities.
So getting feedback on your goals is something that is a really helpful process. If you don't have the opportunity to get feedback from somebody else in person, I have an optional video of our graduate students getting feedback on their goals to help them iterate and refine them.